Welcome on back. A Money Monday it is indeed. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is just a quarter past noon Eastern, high noon here in New York, and the Dow is just about at all-time highs through 27,000 and will break records. And he closes above 27 with some good news will bring us to much higher points in my view. And Bitcoin now above 11,000 and the Bitcoin train is on the tracks and rolling along smoothly. We're rolling along smoothly every day, Monday to Friday, from noon to 1 Eastern, right here from New York. We're coming to you live from the Question Tequila Studios, and we're at the Newsmax HQ today. We have a beautiful lunch provided to us by Freddie and Danny over at Freddie's Gourmet. It's an Italian antipasto with prosciutto balls, some rice balls, potato croquettes. We will feed and our guests, we will give them some alcohol if they wish, and we'll give you all the top news of the day. And we're talking about Trump, we're talking about Iran, and talking to you right now is former presidential advisor, a man who ran for president, and a man who has been highly against and highly outspoken against foreign intervention. Pat Buchanan joins us by phone today. Pat, welcome to Liquid Lunch.
Good to talk with you, Frank.
Hey, it's Frank and John Tobacco. And Mr. Buchanan, you've been, we often say on Liquid Lunch that we bring on guests that have been in the back rooms and the boardrooms and the ballrooms. You've been in all of them. And over decades, I've heard you on every medium talking about how we need to focus more on our country and not be interventionists all around the world. What's your take on this Iran stuff and Trump pushing back on the hawks?
I think the president made a brave decision, and I think he made a correct decision. I think nothing has been lost by him deciding not to kill 150 Iranians in response to the downing of that global hawk. And I think it gives us time to think through what a war with Iran, which is still a real possibility, what that would mean for the United States, for the global economy, and for the world.
Mr. Buchanan, it's Frank Morano. It's good to talk with you again, sir. Thanks, as always, for making yourself available on a day where I know everybody's tugging at you. I am curious about your view of what the president is going to do today in terms of unleashing more sanctions on Iran. Does that risk alienating the Iranian people and their government even more? And if you're not necessarily for sanctions, what would you think is an appropriate response at this juncture?
Well, it's a very good question. The problem with the sanctions is this. They're very effective. They're working. They are choking the Iranian economy. It has dropped by 4% last year. It's going to be by 6% this year. You got inflation, I think, is over 50%. So real hardships are being visited upon the Iranian people, and the Iranian government is feeling the pain. And I think what the situation is now is, but the demands we are making, it's basically that they give up all their allies and they come back to the table to negotiate on nuclear weapons, but they have no nuclear weapons program. So you've got a situation where the Iranians are being asked to capitulate and submit to the United States demands in the form of those 12 demands by Mike Pompeo last year. And so I think what the Iranians are saying, you're not going to be able to choke us completely to death. If push comes to shove, we're going to start shooting, and we're going to start inflicting some pain on you, like we did with that global hawk, shooting that down. And it may come to bloodshed, and it may come to war, but we're not going quietly.
You know, people ask, how do we end up in a war that nobody seems to want? A lot of people think that answer lies with one of your fellow Reagan administration alumni, John Bolton. And the president addressed this head-on in an interview with NBC's Chuck Todd yesterday. This was what the president said about John Bolton and his desire for war. Have a listen to this.
Saudi Arabia is buying $400 billion worth of things for us. That's a very good thing.
You used to say we don't get anything in return for
We are
protecting
now.
Saudi Arabia.
You know that
you feel
this-
like they're now paying for
This
the American
morning,
protection?
I spoke to the Crown Prince this morning, and we had a great conversation.
Yeah.
I said, this is a very expensive operation. You and the other nations that we're protecting have to pay. And he said yes.
Did you talk to him about the UN report about Jamal Khashoggi?
I did not, because it really didn't come up in that discussion. I called about one reason.
I understand.
I called about one reason. I didn't call about that.
Well, Mr. Buchanan, that actually was the him talking about Saudi Arabia rather than John Bolton and Iran. But what he said was that John Bolton, if it was up to him, he would have us at war with the whole world. Now, you were part of the Nixon administration, and you talked about how part of the strength of the Nixon administration was a diversity of opinions. There was Democrats, there was liberal Republicans, and there was conservative Republicans like you. Does the president have a point that guys like Pompeo and Bolton serve a purpose, even if their view of foreign policy isn't necessarily his?
Yeah, he's correct on that. You ought to have hawks in your National Security Council. You ought to have people who are hardliners, and you also should have people who will say, "Mr. President, don't do it. It's a mistake. We've been down this road before. Here's why you ought to be concerned." He ought to have really every point of view represented. I think one of the problems that Trump has, though, is I believe that not only was Mike Pence in favor of the strike on Iran, so too was Bolton, and so too was Pompeo, and so too I think was the head of the CIA. I don't know who's in there very close to Trump, who, like former Secretary Gates, said, you know, anyone who thinks we ought to get into another war in the Middle East, in the words of General MacArthur about Asia, ought to have their head examined.
No doubt about that one. Mr. Buchanan, when I look at this situation, it's to me, it's like a hydra. It's like a multi-headed monster, because people think, oh, we can, go attack Iran. But what people don't realize is they have such capacity right now. They can attack our troops in Syria. They can attack Israel. They can attack our ships in the Gulf, in the Straits of Hormuz. They can attack our troops in Iraq. So a strike on Iran is not as simple as it seems, is it?
No, and people talk about asymmetric warfare. I can remember Ronald Reagan believes the greatest mistake he ever made was putting the Marines in Lebanon. They weren't fighting anyone at the time, but they tilted the balance in a civil war, six-sided civil war, and he got 241 of them murdered in that massive bombing of the Marine barracks, and the American embassy bombed. Now, this is what could happen. We don't know it would happen, but it certainly could. I mean, the Iranians have fighting allies inside Iraq, these popular mobilization units. They've got trained militia inside Syria who helped win that war for Mr. Assad, and they've got personnel all through the Middle East. Bahrain, for example, where the Fifth Fleet, is located in the Persian Gulf, is a predominantly Shia little country with a Sunni king. I mean, if the balloon goes up and there's war with Iran, you don't know where they're going to hit. And of course, they've got hundreds of these small boats that could basically turn the Persian Gulf into a sea of flames before they're sunk, and you get the Persian Gulf shut down for exported oil.
So what is the solution, sir? If sanctions aren't the answer, if military retaliation isn't the answer, given what the president has already done in pulling us out of the Iran nuclear deal, what would you do if you were advising this president?
Well, this is one of the problems. First, the nuclear deal, in my judgment, in terms of what it did, was a good deal for this reason. Iran doesn't want a nuclear weapon. That's the reason they could bring in inspectors and show that they weren't building one. They decided, I think, around 2003, when we did Operation Iraqi Freedom and smashed that place all up, that a nuclear weapon, if they got it, it would simply put Israel's nuclear arsenal on a hair trigger. The Saudis would get a nuclear weapon. The Turks would get a nuclear weapon. They would be no safer than they were to begin with, and they could be very near to a possible, we're going to build a nuclear weapon. We build one, and the Americans got 5,000.
Yeah, so I want to thank Mr. Pat Buchanan for joining us today, three-time presidential candidate, also the author of Nixon's White House Wars. Mr. Buchanan, thank you very much. Your sage commentary is always welcome, and we appreciate you taking a few minutes to join us today on Liquid Lunch.
Thank you very much, folks.
And Tom Coughlin from BCB Bank is going to be here. He's going to be talking to us about the Fed and about what you need to know about interest rates and borrowing money for your small business. All that and more coming up right after this on Liquid Lunch.